and it's time for Chapter 8 of The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White. It was a cold, wet evening, such as may happen even toward the end of August, and the Wart did not know how to bear himself indoors. He spent some time in the kennels, talking to Goat and Cavil, then wandered off to help them turn the spit in the kitchen. But there it was too hot. He was not forced to stay indoors because of the rain by his female supervisors, as happens all too frequently to the decadent children of the present generation. But the mere wetness and dreariness in the open discouraged him from going out. He hated everybody. "Confound the boy," said Sir Ector. "For goodness sake, stop moping by that window there and go find your tutor. When I were a boy, we always used to study on wet days, yes, and educate our minds." "Wart's stupid," said Kay. "I'll run along." Sorry, this is his nurse. "I'll run along, my duck," said their nurse. "I hadn't time to attend thy mopses now, what with all this sorbent washing." "No, then, my young master," said Hob. "Let thee run off to thy quarters and stop confusing thy fowls." "Nay, nay," said the sergeant. "You oop off ought hard to hear. I got enough to do a polishing of this bare lady armour." Even the dog boy barked at him when he went back to the kennels. Wart dragged off to the tower room where Merlin was busy, knitting himself a woolen nightcap for the winter. "I cast off 2 together at every other line," said Merlin, "but for some reason it seems to end too sharply, like an onion, you know. It's like turning the heel it's the turning of the heel that does you every time." "I think we ought to have some more education," said the Wart. "I can't think of anything to do." "You think that education is something which ought to be done when all else fails?" inquired Merlin nastily, for he was in a bad mood too. "Well," said the Wart, "some sorts of education." "Mine?" asked the magician with flashing eyes. "Oh, Merlin," exclaimed the Wart, without answering, "please give me something to do, because I feel so miserable. Nobody wants me for anything today, and I just don't know how to be sensible. It rains so." "You should learn to knit." "Couldn't I go out and be something, a fish or anything like that?" "You've been a fish," said Merlin. "Nobody with any go needs to do their education twice." "Well, could I be a bird?" "If you knew anything at all," said Merlin, "which you don't, you would know that a bird doesn't like to fly in the rain because it wets its feathers and makes them stick together. They get bedraggled." "I could be a hawk in Hobbs' Mews," said the Wart stoutly. "Then I should be indoors and shouldn't get wet." "That's pretty ambitious," said Merlin, "to want to be a hawk. You know you will turn me into a hawk when you want to," shouted Wart. "But you like to plague me because it's wet. I won't have it." "Hoity-toity," said Merlin. "Please," said the Wart. "Dear Merlin, turn me into a hawk. If you don't do that, I shall do something, I don't know what." Merlin put down his knitting, looked at his pupil over the top of his spectacles. "My boy," he said, "you shall be everything in the world, animal, vegetable, or mineral, for all I care, before I've done with you, but you really will have to trust my superior foresight, or is it backside? The time is not ripe for you to be a hawk. For one thing, Hob is still in the Mews feeding them. You may just as well sit down for a moment and learn to be a human being." "Very well," said Wart, "if that's a go." He sat down. After several minutes, he said, "Is one allowed to speak as a human being, or does the thing about being seen and not heard have to apply?" "Everybody can speak." "That's good, because I wanted to mention that you have been knitting your beard into that nightcap for 3 rows now. Well, I'll be filled." "I should think the best thing would be to cut off the end of your beard. Shall I fetch some scissors?" "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I wanted to see what would happen." "You run a grave risk, my boy," said Merlin coldly, "of being turned into a piece of bread and toasted." With this he slowly began to unpick his beard, muttering to himself meanwhile, and taking the greatest precautions not to drop a stitch. "Will it be difficult to fly?" asked the Wart when he thought his tutor had calmed down, "as it was to swim?" You won't need to fly. I don't mean to turn you into a loose hawk, but only to set you in the mews for the night so that you can talk to the others. That's the way to learn, by listening to the experts. Will they talk? They talk every night, deep into the darkness. They say about how they were taken, and what they can remember of their homes, about their lineage and the great deeds of their ancestors, about their training, and what they have learned and will learn. It is military talk. Really, like you might have in a mess of a crack cavalry regiment. Tactics, small arms, maintenance, betting, famous hunts, wine, women, and song. Another subject they have, continued Merlin, is food. It's a depressing thought, but of course they are mainly trained by hunger. They're a hungry lot, poor chaps, thinking of the best restaurants where they used to go, and how they had champagne and caviar and gypsy music. Of course they all come of noble blood. What a shame they should be kept prisoners and hungry. Well, they don't really understand that they are prisoners any more than the cavalry officers do. They look on themselves as being dedicated to their profession, like an order of knighthood or something like that. You see, the membership of the Mews is all restricted to the raptors, and that does help a lot. They know that none of the lower classes can get in. Their screech perches don't carry blackbirds, or such trash as that. And then, as to the hungry part, they are far from starving, or that kind of hunger. They are in training, you know, and like everybody in strict training, they think about food. How soon can I begin? You can begin now if you want to, for my insight tells me that Hob has this minute finished for the night. But first of all, you must choose what kind of hawk you would prefer to be. I should like to be a Merlin, said the Wart politely. The answer pleased the magician. A very good choice, he said. And if you please, we will proceed at once. The Wart got up from his stool and stood in front of his tutor. Merlin put down his knitting. First, you go small, said Merlin, pressing him on top of his head until he was a bit smaller than a pigeon. Then, you stand on the ball of your toes, bend at the knees, hold your elbows to your sides, lift your hands to the level of your shoulders, and press your first and second fingers together, as also your third and fourth. Look, it is like this. With these words, the aged magician stood upon tiptoe and did as he had explained. The Wart copied him carefully and wondered what would happen next. What did happen was that Merlin, who had been saying the final spells under his breath, suddenly turned himself into a condor, leaving the Wart standing on tiptoe unchanged. He stood there as if he were drying himself in the sun, with a wing spread about 11 feet, bright orange head, and a magenta carbuncle. He looked very surprised and rather funny. "Come back," said the Wart. "You've changed the wrong one." "It is by Our Lady spring cleaning," exclaimed Merlin, turning back into himself. "Once you let a woman into your study for half an hour, you don't know where to lay your hands on the right spell. Not if it ever was so. Stand up, and we'll try again." This time, the now tiny Wart felt his toes shooting out and scratching on the floor. He felt his heels rise and stick out behind, and his knees draw into his stomach. His thighs got quite short. A web of skin grew from his wrists to his shoulders, while his primary feathers burst out in little soft quills from the ends of his fingers and quickly grew. His secondaries sprouted out along his forearms, and a charming little false primary sprang from the end of each thumb. The dozen feathers of his tail, with the double-deck feathers in the middle, grew out in the twinkling of an eye, and all the covert feathers of his back and breast and shoulders slipped out of the skin to hide the roots of the more important plumes. Wart looked quickly at Merlin, ducked his head between his legs, and had a look through there, rattled his feathers into place, and began to scratch his chin with the sharp talon of one toe. "Good," said Merlin. "Now hop on my hand. Up, be careful and don't grip, and listen to what I have to tell you. I shall take you into the mews now that Hob has locked up for the night. I shall put you loose and unhooded beside Balin and Balin. Now pay attention. Don't go close to anybody without speaking first. You must remember that most of them are hooded and might be startled into doing something rash. You can trust Balin and Balin. Also the kestrel and the sparhawk. Don't go within reach of the falcon unless she invites you to. On no account must you stand beside Cully's special enclosure, for he is unhooded and will go for you through the mesh if he gets half a chance. He is not quite right in his brains, poor chap. If he once grips you, you will never leave that grip again. Remember that you are visiting a kind of Spartan military mess. These fellows are regulars. As the junior subaltern, your only business is to keep your mouth shut, speak when you're spoken to, and not interrupt. I bet I'm more than a subaltern, said the Wart. I am a Merlin. Well, as a matter of fact, you are. You will find that both the kestrel and the sparhawk are polite to you, but for all sake's sake, don't interrupt the senior Merlins or the falcon. She's the honorary colonel of the regiment, as you know, and as for Cully, well, he's a colonel too, even if he is infantry, so you must mind your P's and Q's. I will be careful, said the Wart, who was beginning to feel rather scared. Good, I shall come for you in the morning before Hobby's up. All the hawks were silent as Merlin carried their new companion into the mews, and silent for some time afterwards, when they had been left in the dark. The rain had given place to a full August moonlight, so clear that you could see a woolly bear caterpillar 15 yards out of doors as it climbed up and up the knobbly sandstone of the great keep. And it took the Wart only a few moments for his eyes to become accustomed to the diffused brightness inside the mews. The darkness became watered with light, with silver radiance, and then it was an eerie sight which dawned upon his vision. Each hawk or falcon stood in the silver upon one leg, the others tucked up inside the apron of its panel, and each was a motionless statue of a knight in armor. They stood gravely in their plumed helmets, spurred and armed. The canvas or sacking screens of their perches moved heavily in a breath of wind, like banners in a chapel, and the rapt nobility of the air kept their night's vigil in nightly patience. In those days they used to hood everything they could, even the goshawk and the merlin, which are no longer hooded according to modern practice. Wart drew his breath at the sight of all these stately figures standing so still that they might have been cut of stone. He was overwhelmed by their magnificence and felt no need of Merlin's warning that he be humble and behave himself. Presently there was a gentle ringing of a bell. The great peregrine falcon had bestirred herself, and now said in a high nasal voice, which came from her aristocratic nose, "Gentlemen, you may converse." There was dead silence. Only in the far corner of the room, which had been netted off for Cully, loose there unhooded and deep in malt, they could hear a faint muttering from the chloric infirmary colonel. And this is one time where I'm going to pause because there is a racial slur in the narrative, and I know that a lot of kids watch these videos. If I was reading you Huckleberry Finn or something like that, I would happily say this word aloud. However, in this instance, I am going to skip over it. He was mumbling, "Damned administration, damned politicians, is this the damned dagger that I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Damned spot! Now, Cully, hast thou one brief hour to live, and then thou must be damned perpetually?" And after that little speech and that rant from Cully, that is where we will pause in Chapter 8.